parse through what I think is the most important things that I think any business would want to look at as it relates to cybersecurity, and really just hone in on 5 things that, as you're looking ahead in 2021, as you're kind of trying to plan through, what would I need to do as a business, as an organization, to be more prepared for some sort of cyber related attack. What are just a few things that I might want to dig into and spend some more intentional time? So that's what I'm going to do today, is just kind of go over 5 things at a pretty high level. This is not an overly technical presentation by any means. And certainly, like Penelope was saying, we're recording this. If I can provide the slides to anyone just to share in their organization, I'm happy to do that. But the presentation itself, just to kind of give you some overview, we're going to start by talking about IT risk assessment. I have a lot of companies just ask me when it comes to cybersecurity, where do I start? It seems like it's just so daunting. There's so many different things out there. Where do I start? So I'm going to give you some ideas and tips on where you may want to start the process, and that would be with an IT risk assessment. And then we're going to look at a specific type of threat, one that you're probably familiar with, and that is ransomware. We get a lot of questions about ransomware preparedness. Am I a target for ransomware? What would happen if this were to hit my company? So I want to talk to you a little bit about what ransomware is and what you might could do to try and minimize the chance of it affecting your business. Then we're going to talk about a couple mechanisms that can help you either prevent or recover from a cybersecurity event, and that being security awareness training, enablement of your staff, as well as backup and disaster recovery, responding to some type of critical event. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is actually something that I'm finding a lot of the folks we work with aren't really familiar with, and that is something called the Microsoft Secure Score. I know a lot of businesses have committed to utilizing some of the Microsoft Office 365 or Microsoft cloud related technologies. And I want to make sure you know what Microsoft is doing to help businesses as they make that move to the cloud, protect that information once it's taken outside the 4 walls, right? Once it's out there in that offsite location. And then when we wrap up, if anybody has questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them. I may not have the answer to every question, but certainly if you have a question, I'll be glad to take it and see if I can find any additional information that I might need. So let's get started and let's talk about specifically IT risk assessment. Like I said a minute ago, a lot of times when I'm in conversations with businesses about cybersecurity, they really don't know where to begin. And as I mentioned, the idea can be a little bit intimidating because there are so many different facets of cybersecurity now. There's so many different vendors out there promoting cybersecurity solutions. There's so many different things that you're being told you need to implement, you need to make sure you have in place. So what I always like to do is I like to advise folks, if you've never really taken a deep dive under the covers, if you've never really looked at where you're vulnerable, if you've ever really assessed the risk within your organization, I think that's where you should start. You should start by doing an IT risk assessment to just try and help you prioritize, to try and create some sort of roadmap moving forward to help you with your remediation efforts. And one of the things you need to understand is, a risk assessment, an IT risk assessment, it's designed to be the first part of an ongoing risk management process. Think of it as kind of this never-ending circle where we assess what risk might be there, we identify that risk and try and prioritize where we need to put our efforts to remediate. And that's kind of the next step, is remediating, actually putting solutions in place to minimize the risk. But once we do that, we really need to start the process all over again, because technology changes, technology evolves, different things are brought into our company that create additional risk. So this is kind of an ongoing process where we assess, we identify, we remediate, and then we assess again. And one of the challenges that I often see companies face, especially today, is, 5, 10 years ago, I might ask, where's your sensitive data? Where is the critical information in your business? And you might take me to a server room, or you might take me to a network closet, and you'd point to a box. And you say, everything sits there. That's all of our critical information. Well, today we have a lot of what we call data sprawl. We have information that still sits on servers. We have information in the cloud. I mentioned Microsoft. We have software companies that we work with that now host information for us. So we have all this information spread around in different locales. And when we go to assess the risk, we have to consider all those different repositories. We have to consider everywhere that we've decided to store critical information. And we have to look at those safeguards, those barriers around each one of those different locations. And that can be a little bit challenging, but it is important to consider all those locations to get a true understanding and a true vision of where the risk might actually lie. So some of the things that I would advise or kind of give to you as advice if you're looking into performing an IT risk assessment, if this is something that maybe you've never done, but it sounds like it's something that you might want to do, the first thing you may want to ask is this something that you want to do internally? Do you want to bring a group together of key folks within different departments and task them with assessing risk? Or do you want to bring in a third-party vendor? One of the challenges I often see with organizations who try to do this internally is they quickly learn that capacity is limited. They don't have quite enough margin to really dedicate the time necessary to do a really good job of thoroughly assessing risk. And so they quickly realize that it's more than they can handle. Of course, the flip side is if you do bring in an external vendor, then of course the cost goes up, right? Because you're gonna have to pay that third party to actually perform the engagement. But it's something you have to consider and kind of weigh the pros and cons of as an organization. Do you want to do this in-house or do you want to outsource it? The other thing you may want to ask is, are all the key stakeholders involved? Is everybody bought in with this idea? You know, a lot of times I see companies get into a risk assessment process and the actual engagement, the actual process of assessing risk kind of becomes siloed in the IT department. And I would advise you that to do a true IT risk assessment, you need to have involvement in other areas. It's very common for us as we're working through IT risk assessments to have conversations with and to perform discovery questions with human resources, with accounting, with executive leadership, because you'd be amazed at the different takes, the different thoughts, the different priorities that might come from those different areas. So you want to ask, do we have buy-in across the organization? Do we have an ability to take this from being just an IT function? Another thing you may want to ask is, well, what would make us the target for an attack? Maybe you work in an industry like healthcare, where the value of your data is exponentially higher than other types of data when being sold on the dark web. So maybe that's what makes you a target. Maybe you work in a very competitive industry and you hold proprietary information that if it were to make it out there would be very valuable to a competitor. Maybe that's what makes you a target. Maybe you just flaunt poor security practices. Maybe people just know that you don't have the safeguards in place and they know you'll be very easily attacked. You want to try to figure out, why would we be the target of an attack? Because it might drive the risk assessment. It might drive you to dig into specific locations on the information technology network. And then finally, and it's a little bit cliche, but what keeps you up at night? What really worries you? What gives you heartburn? We recently went through an engagement where at the very beginning, the director of IT told us, look, everything that we're going to do, everything's very important, but I'm going to tell you guys, the number one thing I'm concerned about is ransomware. He had a lot of peers in his industry be the victim of ransomware. He had a lot of folks that he worked with at other companies in that industry be down for several days, had quite a bit of out-of-pocket expense. And he basically said, I just don't want to be the next one. And so that kind of drove a lot of the conversations around preparedness and incident response and the ability to recovery. That really helped us shape the overall engagement. So again, it does sound a little cliche, but what worries you, what keeps you up at night, that can kind of help drive some of the direction of the assessment itself. This is a very basic matrix, but I thought it might help you if you've never really looked at, something like an IT risk assessment, kind of what you might want to look at, evaluate. And I'll just kind of start from the left and work my way across. If you look at the left, the first thing we're going to identify are the threats, of course. So if you look at that first row, the specific threat might be overheating in a server room or a network closet, somewhere where there's critical information. The threat is that it gets too hot in that particular room. And then we look at the vulnerability. Where are we vulnerable for that threat to exploit us? Well, in this particular situation, the HVAC system is old, so it's prone to failure. Then we look at the asset. What could be targeted? What would be compromised if that vulnerability were to be exploited? And in this situation, it's the servers. The servers are located in that room. They could overheat. Well, now we look at the impact. What would happen? What's the impact on the organization if those assets were to be compromised? And in this situation, those servers, that's where our website, our email, our critical files, our critical applications, that's where they're located. Now, the likelihood, the chance that something might happen in this situation is high because the temperature is already running pretty hot in that room. The old air conditioning system is already struggling with keeping up with the heat. The risk, what could potentially happen in this situation, if the servers were to crash, the estimation is around $50,000 to have to go through a recovery to rebuild servers. And then you basically build a control remediation. You build out a roadmap to remediate those issues. And in this situation, of course, it's to install a new HVAC system. And you just go down the list of the threats, the vulnerabilities, the assets. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to create an overall risk score. You're trying to create what is our overall risk related to various different threats, and how can we prioritize those to, going back to what I said earlier, give us some sort of plan. Where do we start? What's step A? What's step B? What's step C? Now, just some additional guidance that I think you might want to take into consideration. First, you've got to make sure that you look at all three pillars, if you will, of safeguards. And those would be your technical safeguards. Those are the firewalls, the web filters, the antivirus, those technical solutions that you may have invested in to protect information. So of course you want to assess those things. You also want to look at your physical safeguards, those physical barriers, the physical location of critical information, the actual physical entryway to your organization. One of the things that I intentionally discuss when going through an IT risk assessment is something as simple as the locking mechanism. When's the last time you changed the keys? Who all has a key to the building? You want to discuss those physical security barriers that are preventing someone from the outside accessing information on the inside. And then the final safeguard are the administrative safeguards. Those are policies, procedures, overall governance. You want to make sure that you look at what's governing the use of IT in your organization. All three of those need to be looked at during a thorough IT risk assessment. And then you also want to make sure that the assessment doesn't get too technical. I talked earlier about not letting the risk assessment be siloed to the IT department. Well, similarly, you don't want the information that comes out of the risk assessment to be so technical that leadership, management, those in non-technical roles don't really get an understanding of where the risk might lie. I would tell you, if you're looking at hiring a third-party vendor to help you with a risk assessment, ask them to provide you with sample reports, sample documents to show you that they can provide information in a non-technical format, in layman's terms, that you could easily communicate to leadership, those in non-technical roles. Another thing that you want to consider is your third-party relationships. We're spending a lot of time right now working with folks and looking at their vendor management programs, looking at contracts that haven't been updated for several years. It's absolutely critical that you understand if I've entrusted a third party with any role in securing my critical information, you've got to understand what their responsibilities are, what might happen if they were to be the subject of an attack, what's the impact on your business. You really need to take a look at those third-party relationships as part of an IT risk assessment. You need to make sure that any findings are communicated adequately through the organization. What we typically like to do is at the end of an engagement like this, we like to bring leadership together and again, go over kind of a high level 30,000-foot executive summary that just goes over the highlights. Here's what we found, here is where you're at risk, and here's what you need to do moving forward. You need to make sure that that's communicated appropriately throughout your organization. Then the final thing that I'll mention about an IT risk assessment is you may say, we actually do this every year. Maybe it's because of a regulatory requirement, or maybe it's just our internal process. We go through a thorough assessment every year. You have to be careful and not let the risk assessment turn into some rote exercise where somebody's just checking off the boxes every year to say we took care of it. If you have a regular procedure where you go through a risk assessment, consider what you can do to make it fresh. Consider what you can do to make it contemporary. There may be a specific area, perhaps it's written documentation, that you need to spend a little bit more time. I would say take the time, dig into that one particular area, make sure that whatever you're doing, the IT risk assessment creates some relevant information, that it doesn't just become routine and just becomes this kind of exercise where you don't really get anything out of it. So IT risk assessment, it's a great starting point. And again, I think it will help drive risk management, the implementation of other security related items moving forward. So moving ahead, the next thing that I want to discuss is ransomware. So probably a lot of you understand ransomware and what it does. It basically takes the information in your organization and it holds it hostage. It creates an environment where you're not able to read the data, you're not able to access the data, it encrypts it, and you're required to pay some sort of ransom, usually through Bitcoin or other digital currency, to get that information back. This is a pretty rudimentary graphic here, but I think it does a good job just kind of summarizing how this works. If you start on the left side, there's got to be some carrier, some mechanism to bring the ransomware into the organization. So, whether that's somebody getting an email with an attachment that actually has the ransomware inside the attachment, whether it's somebody bringing in a USB drive and plugging it into a computer, and on that USB drive, you actually have the ransomware, or it could be a malicious website that could come in through an email, a link. There's got to be some carrier of the ransomware, but regardless, the user clicks the link, downloads the attachment, they start the process of actually going through the data encryption. That's how the ransomware starts. And then at some point, the data, whether it's on the local PC or whether it's on the entire network, it gets locked, it gets encrypted, it gets unusable. And that's when you start to see the messaging come up that you've been the victim of ransomware. In order to get your data back, here are the instructions, payment of Bitcoin, here's how to contact us, et cetera, et cetera. So again, very, very basic, but that's essentially how this stuff works. We partner with a security, it's actually a disaster recovery company called DATTO, D-A-T-T-O. And every year they like to do this state of ransomware report where they survey a couple of hundred organizations in various industries and ask them questions about their experiences with ransomware. And I wanted to share with you some interesting findings from last year's report, and also give you some thoughts and some things to think about specific to what you might want to do in your organization related to ransomware. So if you look at the actual study, just over half, 51% of the people they surveyed had been the victim of ransomware over the past year. And that aligns with what we're seeing. It seems like every week I get some sort of phone call or have some discussion where either ransomware was deployed and we have to work on recovery, or it was actually thwarted. We know that the malicious email or something malicious came in and we were able to actually stop the attack. But just over half of the respondents had been the victim. Now, of those 51%, of those that had been the victim, 73% of the attacks actually resulted in data encryption. So in that situation, the data itself was encrypted. It was not usable by the organization. It was locked. They had to go to some sort of recovery mechanism. Now, 26% of the victims whose data was encrypted paid the ransom and successfully got their data back. A couple of things I want to share with you on that bullet that I find very interesting. One is I had a chance to talk to a cybersecurity professional. He was actually a forensics expert. And one of the things that he was telling me was all these bad actors, all these cybersecurity criminals, they all deal in different types of ransomware, and they all respond and work with their victims in different ways. He told me one thing you have to watch out for is if you're in a position where you think you're going to pay the ransom to get your data back, maybe it's I'm going to pay just to get the data back quickly. If I go to recover from backup, it's going to take a week or two, and I just want to go ahead and get the data back. One thing the forensics expert shared with me is that there's no guarantee if you pay the ransom that you're going to get the decryption key, the key to unlock the data in any sort of timely fashion. He said it's not uncommon for it to take a week or 2 weeks to actually get the decryption key. So that's something I thought was interesting was, okay, even if you pay the ransom, you may still be out of pocket, if you will, not accessing your data for quite a significant amount of time. Then I had another security professional share with me that the ransom, like I mentioned earlier, is typically paid via Bitcoin, digital currency. And the reason for that is, of course, Bitcoin is very hard to trace. It's very difficult to find where that's going. And so that's why they request you pay in Bitcoin. Now, if you've been watching the digital currency market, Bitcoin and other digital currencies, it's kind of blown up over the past year or so. And the value of Bitcoin has grown exponentially. So I had a cybersecurity professional tell me that a couple of years ago, if you were the victim of ransomware and you knew you had to pay, you could go to a digital currency exchange and exchange US dollar for Bitcoin relatively quickly. A couple hours, you could have whatever Bitcoin you need once you actually process the exchange request. Now, because of the volatility, if you will, the excitement in that market, he was telling me that it's not uncommon for it to take up to a week to 2 weeks for the actual exchange to take place. So what he had actually, and this is again a cybersecurity professional, what he had actually started advising his clients to do is, as part of their kind of incident response plan, have a stash of Bitcoin ready. Go ahead and go out, go ahead and make the exchange, have it ready so that if you found yourself in a situation where, let's say, a pocket of data you thought you might have been backing up was not backed up for whatever reason, you needed to pay the ransom, that you had the Bitcoin ready, that you weren't having to wait on the exchange. I thought that was a very, very interesting comment, a very, very interesting recommendation that this particular person was making. So I thought I would mention it to you guys. Now, going down the list some more, the average cost to remedy or rectify the impacts of a ransomware attack, considering ancillary factors like downtime, loss of productivity with your personnel, et cetera, $732,000 for companies who did not pay the ransom. So they didn't pay the ransom. They were able to recover internally. They still had $750,000 of costs once they accounted for the downtime, the investment they probably had to make in secondary security softwares, those kinds of things, $732,000. Now, for those who did pay the ransom, the number grows up to almost 1.5 million. And that tells me a couple of different things. Number one, again, these ancillary costs are quite high. But number two, the actual amount demanded today from the cyber criminals for the actual ransom has grown significantly. Back in the past, it wasn't uncommon to see, with the exchange rate, around $500 to $1,000 being requested to unlock data. Now it's very, very common to see that number in the 5 to 6 digits, again, depending on the organization being attacked. So the cost of a ransomware attack, we keep seeing the numbers grow. The next item there, 1 in 5 organizations surveyed found they had major holes in their cybersecurity insurance. And to give you an example of something I saw recently, we saw an organization be the victim of a wire fraud, a wire transfer fraud, where a user in their company had received an email. It appeared to be from a reputable vendor. It was requesting a wire transfer. They facilitated the transfer. It turned out that it was a malicious attempt. It was fraudulent. When they took the case to their cyber carrier, the carrier basically took the posture of, well, because this incident was something that was essentially the result of your staff person clicking on a link and doing the wire transfer, this wasn't the result of somebody getting through a firewall or breaking through a physical security safeguard, we're not going to pay. This is not covered in your policy. And so if you look at this stat, 1 in 5 organizations surveyed found they had major holes. That's a great example. I would encourage, and I'll touch on this in a little bit, make sure you know exactly what your policy covers as it relates to the different types of cyber related activity. And the starting point, of course, is to have the cyber policy in the first place. But if you do have a cyber policy, and if you're having conversations with your carrier, make sure you clearly understand what it covers and make sure you know how you're protected, whether it be with ransomware, wire fraud, so on and so forth. Then the final bullet here, 59% of attacks where data was encrypted actually involved data in the public cloud. And that we're talking about your Microsoft Office 365, your Google, your G Suite, your Dropbox. You're talking about data that sits in that big public cloud. And what happens is that the ransomware, the sophisticated ransomware, before it actually starts the encryption process, it's going to see where all your data sits and can I get to that data. And if you've got an open connection to those cloud repositories, it's oftentimes going to find its way there and it's going to encrypt that data too. And a lot of times what happens is if there are lax access controls in your organization, it actually starts to affect your backup. We very, very often see, because there wasn't good segmentation, that there wasn't good barriers in place between what we call the production system and the actual backup data, that once that ransomware takes hold, it actually makes its way to the backup data and it encrypts it as well. So you go to recover from the backup and you realize you can't use it because it's encrypted too. And oftentimes that data is in the cloud. So something to consider. Now, prevention, mitigation. there should be a huge asterisk and a huge caveat before I get into the slide, because there's no such thing as 100% secure. You could have everything on this slide put in place, plus another 10 additional security safeguards, and you could still fall victim to ransomware. The idea here is we're, again, trying to minimize the chance. We're trying to do everything we can to mitigate our potential of being the victim of ransomware. So I'm just going to start from the left and work my way over. The first thing you may want to consider is implementing multi-factor, two-factor authentication, especially if you have anybody in your organization that is getting access to critical information outside your office. So if you have staff that are working remote and they're using maybe something like a VPN client to get back into your office, if you're using something like Office 365 and you have staff accessing email outside the office, then I would highly recommend implementing some second layer of authentication. What that does is it helps prevent the password and you to get access to systems where they could then actually plant or launch some sort of attack like ransomware. It requires that second layer of authentication, typically through an application or something on a mobile device to provide that second layer of authentication. So I'm a big fan of MFA, of two-factor authentication. The second bullet there, implement a robust, centrally managed malware prevention tool and consider advanced endpoint detection and response. So, for many years, we had antivirus, right? We had security software on our computers that was designed to prevent, a piece of malware, malicious software, from doing what it's supposed to do, from taking advantage of our computer and putting us in a precarious situation. Now, traditional antivirus, the way it works is these big security companies, the Symantecs, the McAfee's, the Trend Micros, they've got security professionals constantly scouring the internet, trying to find the latest malicious software. And when it finds a new piece of software, it creates a definition, it creates an update, and it sends it to the antivirus. It says, hey, we found something new. If you see this, then block it, quarantine it. This is malicious in nature. The problem with that, of course, is that the antivirus that runs on your computer, it has to wait on those definitions, right? So it's only as good as the latest definition. And a lot of these contemporary attacks, a lot of the newer ransomware, a lot of the newer malicious software, we've never seen before. And so it can actually get past the antivirus because there is no definition for it. It doesn't recognize it as malicious. Some of the newer endpoint protection, some of the newer security software, they don't necessarily rely on those definitions. They use what's called machine learning, and it's actually a version of artificial intelligence where instead of relying on a definition, the software actually looks at the machine it's protecting, and it gets a concept, it gets an idea of what does this machine look like in a normal state? What does it look like day to day? And if I start to notice abnormal changes, if I start to notice things on this computer that aren't necessarily what I see day to day, then I'm going to create some sort of mechanism to alert someone that something malicious may be taking place on this machine based on what I'm seeing, file level changes, different things that are occurring that don't seem normal. And again, not relying on that definition keeps that contemporary at all times. Now, adding a layer on top of that, a lot of the more contemporary security companies are providing a layer of response. So where if that software sees something malicious, it also contacts a group of human beings who then actually look at it and start responding to the attack, whether it's Wednesday morning at 2 a.m., Sunday afternoon at 7 p.m., doesn't matter the time. You have a group of professionals who are responding to that event around the clock. That's the response side of what you see there. So one of the things you may want to consider is how contemporary is just the basic security software you're using, and can it be upgraded to some of these, what they call it, next generation type softwares. The next bullet there is talking about user access, limiting user access, going through user access audits, and using least privilege. So I mentioned earlier when we were talking about ransomware that oftentimes it traverses itself across the network. It tries to find how far can I go before I actually start encrypting, because the ransomware wants to encrypt as much as possible. It wants to do as much damage as it can. A lot of times, the way that it actually makes its way across the network is because it's taken advantage of a user's access level. That user's access is way too elevated. And because that user can get essentially anywhere on the network the ransomware or the malicious software can do the same. I highly recommend that as you're setting up new employees, as you're going through regular reviews of the access that's been granted to existing employees, implement this concept of least privilege. Make sure that if I provide someone with access to any resource on my computer network, I'm only going to provide them with just the level of access they need to do their job and nothing more. If they need additional access, they're going to have to come and request that. We're not just going to open up and give them the keys to the kingdom. That can really help mitigate some of these more sophisticated threats who, again, take advantage of that elevated user access. The next one, make sure you have a good, robust patch management system. We're talking about your Windows devices, your third-party softwares like Adobe. You want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to update those systems, to make sure that the latest security updates are being applied, because there are specific cyber criminals out there who are doing nothing but looking for vulnerabilities in Microsoft Windows 10, Microsoft Server 2019. And once they find that vulnerability, they're going to do everything they can do to exploit it before a patch can come out. And so you want to make sure you're keeping those patches updated. You want to make sure that you're defending yourself against, they call them zero-day vulnerabilities. They're brand new threats that the developers, Adobe, Microsoft, et cetera, have not previously identified. So that needs to be something that is systemic, that is kind of managed within your organization. The next two, I'm going to dig into a little bit deeper, but just to kind of cast some vision, security awareness training, promoting awareness in your staff is certainly a way to help minimize the chance that ransomware can occur. And then the last bullet there, disaster recovery, data backup, making sure you have a mechanism in place to respond and recover to a ransomware attack. Very, very important. And those two, I think, really do require some additional conversation. So that's where we're going next. Starting with security awareness training. This is something that I'm a huge advocate of. We've been doing security awareness training inside Jackson Thornton, I want to say now for about 5 years. And I can't tell you how much of an improvement I've seen, especially with the folks in our office who aren't necessarily technical, who don't have a technical responsibility, who don't live in the world of IT. I've just seen their level of awareness, their level of understanding the amount of threats that are out there grow exponentially ever since we started a security awareness training program. Education is vital, whether you're at the front desk, whether you're in the accounting department, whether you're in more of a production role. It's very important to understand if I have access to sensitive information, then I am a target, right? I am being attacked every day, because what happens is the bad guys, they know if I can get somebody to click on an email, then it doesn't matter what type of firewall you have in place. It doesn't matter what type of security solutions you've invested in. If I can get to the point where I can get somebody to click on an email, then I've made my way around every bit of that. It didn't do anything to protect the company. I can still get access. I can still harvest credentials. I can still plant that ransomware. So it's very, very important that you train and educate. And what I often see, and I've had organizations ask me to come in and do this, once a year, once every 6 months, you get everybody together, you put them in a conference room, you do a presentation just like this, and everybody's drinking with a fire hose, right? It's a all-day session. We're going to talk about everything going on in the company. We're going to talk about cybersecurity. And then once we're done, we're going to get back to our jobs. And what happens is that within minutes, we get back into our daily routine and we forget 95% of what we just learned. And so that's why it's so important to kind of keep this on a schedule, to keep it routine, to keep it top of mind, and have this cadence of training be sent out on a frequent basis. Now, as a leader or as somebody in your organization who takes cybersecurity seriously, one thing I would tell you is, as you're talking to staff, just know, use your common sense. Be skeptical. If you see an email that gives you some heartburn, that you look at it and you go, this guy has never sent me something like this, or I've never corresponded with this vendor in this way, then have somebody else take a look at it. Pick up the phone and call. Did you send me this email? Because it says it's from you, but it's asking me to transfer some money, or it's asking me to go get some gift cards for you. So I just wanted to make sure that you actually did send this. Common sense and having that level of skepticism it can really help minimize some of the attacks. And a lot of that can be trained through the security awareness training program. It kind of creates that awareness and causes people to be more skeptical. What you see here is just kind of a screenshot of some of the training that we do at Jackson Thornton. It's designed to be quick, self-service, 5 or 10 minutes of time. You watch a quick video. This particular one was on social engineering. I've had to do security training on ransomware, on mobile device management, all sorts of different topics. But the idea is that it's not taking up a lot of my time. And then I'm doing it for us, it's once a month. We have to go through some sort of training process. And again, that's what keeps it top of mind. Now, one thing that you may want to consider, it relates back to policy and procedure. Now, first, sanction policy, you need a sanction policy. You need something in place that says if you abuse information technology, if you use IT in a way that it's not designed for or goes against what our acceptable use policy is, then here are the consequences. Now, in that sanction policy, one thing you may want to consider is how are we going to apply that to security awareness training? In our organization, if someone doesn't complete their training, and we typically give them a month, you're assigned a training module at the beginning of the month and it's due at the end of the month. If the completion is not done by the end of the month, then their access to our network systems is revoked. We take that away until the training is complete. That's the consequence. I've seen different consequences put in place. You have to determine what's appropriate, but I would recommend having some sort of sanction policy in place that specifically addresses non-completion of training. And then conversely, just to give you another example, I have a company that I work with who also wanted to reward folks. So they basically said, look, if we get 100% completion this month, we're going to give everybody a Visa gift card for completing it. So there's carrots and sticks, right? You get rewarded if you complete it, but you get penalized if you don't. So that's something that you might want to consider. Now, other things besides this training mechanism that we're talking about here can be put in place to increase awareness. What you see on your screen now is actually available for free. You can go to SANS, S-A-N-S. It's a nonprofit organization that promotes cybersecurity to all organizations. But you can go to their website, download this image. It's a file that you can download. You can then take that to a print shop and have it printed out, poster size, get it laminated, and put this anywhere you might have a time clock, anywhere that you might have a set of office cubicles, something just as simple as a visual sign that somebody might pass on the way to get a cup of coffee, they might pass on the way to the restroom. We're trying to create awareness, right? That's all we're trying to do. So they may see this, go back to their desk, see an email, and go, you know what, this indicator C here, this is in this email. So this is probably a phishing attack. So just something as simple as a sign and visual reminders can help create the awareness that we're looking for. Now, that's only part of security awareness. We train, we educate. You've got to test. It's just like going to school, right? When you're in a classroom, you're educated, you're trained on a specific topic, and then we test to ensure that the information is retained. It's the same thing when it comes to cybersecurity and trying to create awareness in your staff. We have to test to make sure that the information is being retained. And there's a lot of different ways that we can test. The most common way, of course, is with these simulated phishing exercises. We send out simulated mock phishing emails to see who opens the email, who clicks on the email, who would be a victim of a real phishing attack. And what we recommend is if someone fails a phishing test, that you provide additional intentional training for that staff person. We call those folks clickers. They click on emails they shouldn't. So we put them in a clickers group and we give them more training. But you can do other ways of testing. I talked earlier about ransomware and how it can come in through a USB drive. You can take a USB drive, put files on that drive, plant it in your lobby, in your parking lot. When somebody puts that drive in a computer, those files are designed to call home. So they can tell me the computer that opened the file, the user who was logged into the computer when the file was opened. I can identify who may just be the victim of curiosity. They see something like a USB drive and they want to know what's on it. You can test in that way too. And then you can also do over the phone. I can do a robotic call to someone to say something like, your IT department has decided to change your voicemail system. You need to enter a new PIN code to see if they would be willing to give information over the phone. And then finally, I have seen organizations actually go to the point where someone actually impersonates a third-party vendor, the example I always like to use is somebody impersonating pest control. They put on the uniform, they have the canister, they come in, and they basically just say, I'm Joe with the pest company, I'm here to spray. And what you're trying to do is you're testing the access controls at that point. You're testing whether or not somebody will say, Joe, I'm glad you're here. I don't recognize you. Nobody told me you were coming. I need to go make sure it's okay for you to be here. Or are you just going to say, hey, come on in, just go wherever you need to go? I'm testing the access control of the company to see how far I can get just based on wearing a uniform of a pest control company. So something else that you might consider. What you see here on your screen is actually what comes up when we do this testing. This is what the user sees, is that you clicked on the phishing email. And again, that's when we put them in that clickers group to provide them with the additional intentional training that they have to pass once they fail the actual phishing test. Now, security awareness training, empowering your folks to actually recognize the threat. Well, what happens when the threat actually occurs, right? How do you recover? And that's when we get into data backup and disaster recovery. And this can be a very big topic, so please keep in mind, I'm kind of skimming the surface here when we talk about backup and disaster recovery. But just to give you some pointers, again, if you're looking at 2021 as this is a topic we need to look at, I'm not confident in our ability to respond and recover. At a bare minimum, when looking at data backup and disaster recovery, policies, procedures, and technologies need to be implemented to ensure that any critical information is backed up and can be restored. Now, there's a lot in that one sentence. Policies and procedures. You've got to make sure that you know the process. If we were to have ransomware hit us, what is our process to recover? I know there's a box in there, and I know it's our backup, but I don't really know how we would recover if the server were to be encrypted. How do we actually recover? Does somebody have to bring in another server? Do we have to call somebody? What's the process? That needs to be formally defined and documented as part of this process. And you need to know, am I relying on a third-party vendor to do everything? Am I going to have some responsibility in the recovery process? Those are things that you need to think through when making sure you have a good data backup and disaster recovery system in place. Now, keep in mind, disaster recovery planning, this idea of having a process, that's different than just data backup. And I put a couple definitions that I think sometimes help. We talk about data backup. All we're talking about there is a copy, right? If I have a database, if I have a set of very, very critical information, if I create a copy, a replica of that data, then I've created a backup. That's all that is. This concept of business continuity, this concept of recovery, and regardless of the event, it's a lot more deeper. It's a lot more involved. Basically, the idea is that regardless of what were to happen, if we were to be the victim of ransomware, if we were to have some sort of fire, flood, act of God type event occur, regardless, we're going to be able to continue our business operations. That's true business continuity. And it really is a lot more involved and a lot more complex than just thinking about taking a copy of critical information. Now, if you're looking at, okay, 2021, this is one area we want to look at very, very intentionally, data backup, disaster recovery. Some tips that I would give you, some advice. The first thing you need to think about is recovery time. How long do we want to take before we're back up and going? I used the example earlier. We were talking about ransomware and how long it might take to get the actual decryption key back. You need to know how long it's going to take to recover from a backup system. Is it going to take a few hours and we're back up and running, or is it going to take literally weeks for us to get a new server in place, to actually take the copy of the data and restore it? You need to know, number one, what you have right now, and number two, what do we want as an organization? What is acceptable? If we were to have a disaster today and we know it's going to take 7 days to recover, and we've identified that's not acceptable, well, what is acceptable? Do we need to shrink that down to 1 day, to 2 hours? That's something that you need to think about as an organization. And then the other point, the recovery point objective, that's the idea of how much data could we lose and not have it be a significant impact on the organization. Could we withstand 1 hour's data loss? Could we withstand a day's worth of data loss? There are solutions out there. There are backup systems that simply allow you to flip the switch, right? Something bad happens, you flip the switch and you're back up and going. There is no loss. Recovery time is literally in seconds. Of course, those systems, those solutions have a pretty high cost investment requirement, right? So what I advise companies is when looking at recovery time and recovery point objectives, you also have to balance that with the cost. You have to figure out what's appropriate based on our organization, our tolerance for downtime, what's the appropriate amount to invest in a solution that gives us the right recovery time and the recovery point objective. Those are decisions that have to be made internally. Now, another question you want to ask is, how easy is it to test the solution? In other words, how easy is it for us to do a test of the system to actually recover and restore? A lot of systems, the recovery process is very cumbersome. It basically takes a lot of work, a lot of time to even go through a test. Some systems, however, it's very easy. Some systems have tests basically automatically baked into them. It's something to ask. And if you've never tested your backup, if you're curious about your current backup solution, that's a question to ask IT is, what would it take to test the current system? What would it take if we wanted to come in and simulate a critical event? What would it take to test the system that we have right now to ensure that we could actually use it if we were to have a real event occur? You want to think about data encryption. If you're living under some sort of regulatory requirement where data security is extremely important, you want to think about, do I have to encrypt this information, this copy that I'm making? Do I have to encrypt that copy? And if I send it off site to a third party, do I have to send it off in an encrypted fashion? And is it encrypted once it hits that offsite facility? Those are some good questions that may help you with like a vendor vetting process. Of course, you need to understand roles and responsibilities and what's being backed up, what can be recovered. And really what I'm trying to get at there is that sometimes there's a misconception around where that critical data sits and what's actually being backed up. Typically on site in an organization's office, typically what's backed up is on the server, right, on kind of the centralized place where data is stored. But a lot of times what we find is that critical information isn't necessarily living on the server. It may be sitting on somebody's desktop. It might be in a drive that sits in somebody's purse that goes home every day. You want to make sure that you know what's being backed up and are there any gaps. This is a great place to do a gap analysis. Here's what's being backed up. Here's our critical information. Wherever there might be gaps, we need to work on making sure that critical information that's not being backed up becomes part of the backup process. Know your role. I talked about it earlier. Is this something that requires a heavy lift for the organization? Or is it basically we make a phone call and a third-party vendor does everything for us? You need to know your role in the process. And then finally, of course, you do vet any vendor very thoroughly, especially if you have regulatory requirements. If you're living under something like HIPAA or any other regulatory requirement, you want to make sure whatever vendor you're working with understands those requirements and can apply those to any backup solution that they might put in place. Now, just wrapping up the last item, the Microsoft Secure Score. So I'm sure a lot of you have started to or may have been for quite a while using Microsoft Office 365. It's become fairly ubiquitous with the clients we work with, whether it's their email files that they work with, there's some component of their data that sits in Microsoft's cloud. Microsoft is wanting to do everything they can to secure that information and make sure that you're doing everything you can to protect that information based on the tools, the features, the functionality available to you in Office 365. So what they've done is they've created what they call the Secure Score. And what you see here is the actual screen when you log into the Microsoft Secure Score site. This is the screen you would see. And what it basically does is it looks at your environment, whether that be email, files that may be stored in OneDrive or SharePoint, looks at all the different functionality in 365, and it looks at what security has been implemented to protect that information in Office 365. And why this is so important and why I wanted to make sure I mentioned it was we've seen a significant uptick in the amount of attacks that are specifically targeting users of Office 365. And it makes a lot of sense, right? These bad guys, these cyber criminals, they know companies have started moving to Office 365. They know that there's a lot of data that used to be in a server on site in an office that now resides in Office 365. So they've shifted their target, they've shifted their efforts to the Microsoft cloud. And that's why I think Microsoft has tried to catch up, if you will, and provide these type of services. They define the Secure Score as a numerical summary of your security posture based on system configurations, user behavior, and other security related measurements. It isn't an absolute measurement of how likely your system or data will be breached. And I think that's important. It isn't an absolute. If your Secure Score is 100%, it doesn't mean something bad can happen. It just means that it represents the extent to which you have adopted security controls in your Microsoft environment that can help offset the risk of being breached. And what's nice is when you produce your secure score, it actually, Microsoft provides ways to improve the score based on certain things that could be implemented within your specific Office 365 environment. So here I've given you the link where you can actually go, and if you use Office 365, you log in using your credentials, you can see your secure score. But I've given you what we see as the top ways to typically improve that score. I talked about multi-factor authentication earlier. That's a big one. As soon as that's turned on, your score definitely improves. Another thing you can do is Microsoft has done a lot with mobile device management, the ability to control and manage mobile devices, phones, tablets that access Office 365 resources. So we can enable mobile data encryption and mobile device password requirements so that if a device is set up to communicate to Office 365, if it doesn't have those two protocols, if it doesn't have data encryption and a password set, then the data can't hit that device. It's not going to allow data to actually get on that device until those two things are set up on the actual piece of hardware. Password expiration policy, you want to make sure the password's changing. And a lot of times what we try to do, and I think this would be considered best practice, is password expiration policy is something that's a good best practice across any network resource. So what we try to do is we try to map and integrate whatever we set up on the local network. In other words, what's set up on the local Windows network to change passwords every 60, 90, 120 days. We try to map and integrate that to Office 365. So the same policy applies in both places. Audit logs, this is very important. And to be honest with you, it can get a little bit confusing because there's a lot of different types of auditing we can do in Office 365. The intent and why you would want to turn auditing on is if you had an event occur where somebody's mailbox may be compromised, you want to see when did the email get compromised? What did they do when they got in the mailbox itself? Did they mine the information? Did they try and extract the information? Did they forward any emails? Did they change any of the rules? You want to be able to see what activity might have taken place in an account that was compromised, and you can get that data through audit logs. So you want to make sure those are implemented and configured. And then finally, you want to restrict your global administrator roles. Basically, you want to restrict the amount of users in Office 365 who have the ability to go in and make changes, do administrative tasks. Really, there really should only be 1 or 2 people in an organization that have that global administrator role. More than that, you really have to have a good understanding of why that's necessary. So you're restricting your global admin roles can definitely improve your security posture and thus improve your Microsoft Secure score. So those are the 5 things. I want to wrap up real quick and just give you some final takeaways. The first thing, as a leader in your organization, create a good culture, create a security culture. Make sure that everyone knows that this is important, that, hey, we may be a small business, but you know what? Small businesses are being targeted too. We may not have a lot of sensitive data, but you know what? If our system were to be compromised and we were to be down for a week, it would really hurt. So create a culture. I had an old band director, he loved to use the term bell cow. He told the leaders, be a bell cow, be a leader, and lead by example. Create this security culture within your organization. Have experts on the ready, right? So if you have good internal IT resources, make sure that they're up to speed on the latest cybersecurity threats. Make sure they have good relationships with third parties that they can lean on if there were to be an incident. But just make sure that you feel very comfortable about your ability to reach out and work with folks if an event were to occur. If you're unsure of how to respond, if you're unsure of what your requirements are, if you have a breach, if you have an incident occur and you really just don't know what to do, it's always good to seek legal counsel. Every state, including Alabama was the 50th state. Every state has implemented a data privacy law where organizations are required to protect information, to have somebody designated as the information security officer, and to go through a actual process to notify if a certain level is reached when it comes to data breach. If a certain number of records, if you will, are breached, there is a notification process. So if you're unsure of what your requirements are, and it could be that you live under one of those federal statutes like HIPAA, it's always good to seek legal counsel to help you discern what your requirements might be in terms of notifying people of a breach, in terms of actually putting this out in the public domain. It's always good to have legal counsel on the ready there. And then finally, I talked about cybersecurity insurance earlier. I cannot advocate enough for having a good, robust cyber policy in place. I've had to work on multiple cases with a cyber insurance group who were brought in specifically because of an incident, and the level of resources that they can potentially bring to the table in terms of forensics, in terms of legal counsel, just being there and being your advocate. Say, hey, this is why we have this policy. We're here to protect you in the event that this type of thing were to occur. It's very, very important. So talk to your insurance carrier. If you have a policy in place, make sure you clearly understand how it would apply, in the various different events that we've talked about. If you don't have a policy, certainly I would recommend going out and taking a look at what might be available. So I've linked a couple of resources that I thought might be helpful. Some documents here that are free. If you're looking for additional information, if you want some information that you can print out and share with anybody in your organization, there's some hyperlinks that I've had to use when I get some questions from time to time from clients. So feel free to use those. But that's all I have. Penelope, if anybody has questions, I'll be happy to stick around and answer any that anybody might have.
Okay, Nic, thank you so much for speaking to us. You did a great job, and this was some definitely informative information that we could all use in our businesses. And if anybody needs to connect with you on a one-on-one level, the email, your phone number is right there for everyone to contact you directly. So,
Correct.
Nic, thank you so much, and we thank
you.
everybody that joined us today.
Have a good day. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Nic.
Thank you.